Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out on a rainy day to Flyleaf Books. We appreciate your support of our independent bookstore as well as this wonderful author. This evening, we have the pleasure of hearing from Chris Latre presenting his new memoir, Becoming Little Shell, A Landless Indian's Journey Home. Chris Latre is a Métis storyteller, a descendant of the Pembina band of the mighty Red River of the North, and an enrolled member of the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians. He's also an award-winning author and poet. We hope that you enjoy the talk. Thank you again. Remember, you can grab a copy of Becoming Little Shell up front if you have not gotten one already, and then you can get it signed after the talk. So, see you all there. Enjoy.
Bonjour. Bonjour, Indinwe Maganadag. Chris Ka Shinikashin. That is hello, all of my relatives in Anishinaabemoan, which is the language of my people, the Little Shell Chippewa. And it also is, you can call me Chris in Michif, which is the other language of my Little Shell people. We are comprised of Chippewa people and largely of Métis people, which may mean nothing to some or most of you, and that's okay. And we're going to talk about who we are. I have this awesome collection of medallions that I usually wear, and I know I packed one, and I couldn't find it. Because you got to accessorize yourself when you do an event like this, right? So I got these awesome local reading glasses to accessorize with instead, to kind of make this a little bit more accessorized. So the way I like to start is usually reading kind of a condensed version of the introduction to the book. It kind of sets the baseline for what it's all about. And then I'll talk a little bit from there. And then what I really want to get to is Q&A. And I'm hoping that you have arrived with questions. And it could be anything about the book. It could be anything you want to ask about. Because that just feels a little bit more worth coming out for a conversation than just someone that you'll never see again just talking at you for 45 minutes or whatever. So that's the plan. It's a midsummer morning in 2022 in western Montana, and dark clouds boil and roil and threaten thunderstorms. After days of swelter, the precipitation is welcome, but the threat of wildfire by lightning is real. I'm driving my gray 1999 Nissan Frontier pickup. I merge onto Interstate 90 westbound where it intersects with Montana Highway 93 at the western edge of Missoula. These two routes, I-90 east-west, 93 north-south, are swarmed with tourist traffic every summer. These yearly visitors are here because this place is beautiful. The valley formed by the confluence of the Blackfoot, Bitterroot, and Clark Fork rivers is bordered by rolling mountains. Below the conifer-covered tree line, despite summer settling in with a vengeance, their slopes still show a hint of spring's green where they aren't patched in yellow arrowleaf balsam root. Indigenous words are on my mind today. There are countless shiny cars, hulking SUVs, and gigantic pickups pulling trailers loaded with canoes and kayaks and bicycles. I note names like Tacoma and Denali on their bumpers. Same with RVs called Yukon and Winnebago. There are others too, Indian names all, in a place not that many Indians remain. I've thought about Indians my entire life. I grew up with the vague knowledge that my father's side of the family was Indian, Chippewa specifically, as my grandmother would speak of it at times. I have a dim memory of being 4 years old and sitting on the faded linoleum kitchen floor of our little farmhouse in Huson, assaulting a coloring book with crayons. When asked why I depict a pair of children with red skin, I say it's because they're Indians. My visiting grandmother, Ruby Catherine Doney Latre, sitting at the table asks, "Is my skin red?" "No, but I'm an Indian, and so are you." I was very young, and now I'm not, but the memory has stuck with me. It wasn't until my grandfather died just shy of 83 years of age in late September 1996 that pieces started falling into place. I was 29 years old. A decade earlier, fresh out of high school, two friends and I headed west on the same Interstate 90 I'm traversing today, on our way to Seattle to become rock stars. I hadn't seen my grandparents since making the move. By 1996, I was married with a 3-year-old son who would never meet his great-grandfather, living closer to Tacoma than Seattle and working a job that required a long, traffic-infested commute that was slowly killing my will to live. The dreams of rock and roll glory were over. I like to tell people my bandmates and I arrived in Seattle with bags full of spandex and leather when the city was on the cusp of dressing all their musical heroes in flannel and ripped jeans. In 1996, I made the drive to Plains, Montana for the funeral. Though I barely knew my grandfather, I was one of the pallbearers. It was a beautiful fall day in early October. I left my Washington home in the wee hours of morning, crossed Snoqualmie Pass eastbound through the jagged and magnificent Cascade Mountains at sunrise, then blew through the croplands of eastern Washington as the day expanded in my windshield. The sun was bright. The foliage was changing to vivid reds and yellows, and the air was crisp and clean the entire way. Arriving at the small Catholic church in Plains, I was amazed to find the nave crowded with Indians. I took my seat in the front row beside my dad and stared around in a state of puzzled awe. During the service, which I barely remember, it seemed to be more about Jesus than my grandfather. Dad kept poking me in the ribs and trying to make me laugh. When we exited the church and prepared to join the procession to the cemetery, Dad leaned in and asked, "So, what did you think about all those Indians?" "There were a lot of them," I said, for lack of a better answer. What I didn't say was how astounded I was. Something my dad and his father had in common was the denial of any indigenous heritage. Suggesting my dad was native made him angry. I could never understand why. I was the opposite. I wanted to be Indian. I wanted that identity, and I took it for myself, even if it had to be largely locked up. To me, it was cool. Who wouldn't want to be Indian? Who wouldn't want to be Chippewa? My grandfather's funeral was a turning point in my curiosity about my family history. Here was a collection of people I'd never known but was clearly connected to. Who were they? Why didn't I know them? Why was I never allowed to know them? What was our family story? I went home with more questions, only now I could see much more clearly where I came from, even if nobody in my family talked about it. Whenever anyone asked my dad about other Latrés in Montana, and there are many of us, he would deny any relation. I never heard him utter the words Little Shell, Rocky Boy, Turtle Mountain, or even Chippewa that I recall, nor Métis, all words for people and places critical to my life now. My dad spent his life denying his indigenous heritage and, through his choice, mine as well, sometimes vehemently. Referring to my dad as Indian in any way, in most contexts, bordered on fighting words. If pressed, his calmest response was refer to the entire idea of Indianness as complete bullshit. When he passed away in 2014, Dad left me with a lifetime of questions about who he was and where he came from. No, who we are, where we come from. I'm certain he had the answers to many of these questions, but he chose to take them with him to his grave. I decided I would do what I could to find them on my own. If not from him, then through people who lived a similar experience, through the story of our people. This book is an attempt to answer some of those questions, to tell the story of my own family heritage, certainly, and why my dad felt the way he did about his heritage. If I've learned anything at all, it's that I'm not the only one to grow up in these kinds of circumstances. I'm also not alone in trying to find my way back to who I was all along, a proud Indian. I'm not a scholar. I'm not a historian. I don't have an academic bone in my body. I'm a storyteller, and this is a story that needs telling. I feel compelled to share the story of the Métis people of Montana with the world, to tell the story of the Little Shell tribe, the longtime landless Indians of Montana. Because it's clear we're largely unknown, not just to the wider world, but even in Montana, the first state to recognize us as a legitimate tribe, despite our centuries-old association with a larger indigenous family. Like the stories of all indigenous tribes of the Americas, it's a sad story. but it is also a triumphant story of the baddest buffalo people the world has ever seen. It's a story still unfolding. So that is my condensed version of the introduction. So who are the Little Shell? We are the most recently federally restored tribe in the United States of America. So we are number 574. And we received that like on a Thursday in December of 2019. And by Monday, I had it tattooed on my knuckles as a way to like never forget, because I forget stuff. And it'll probably happen tonight. I'm going to think of something and it's going to be profound. And by the time it makes it to my mouth, I will have forgotten what it was. So if you think, that guy isn't that smart, just remember all the smart stuff I forgot on the way to delivering it to you people. So yeah, December 2019. So a lot of times people will think, well, if you're only just this recently recognized, are you real Indians or not? Most tribes received their federal recognition as a result of treaties with the United States. And in 1871, the United States decided, well, we're not going to recognize indigenous tribes as sovereign nations anymore, and therefore we're not going to engage in any more treaties with indigenous tribes. And we were on the other side of that date. Though what ultimately made us a diaspora of people spread out across lands that we hunted in for centuries, but had not necessarily lived in full time. Ours started like in the 1850s, and it was like 1892 when kind of the telling blow that made us landless in the first place, and it was over 150 years of trying to prove who we really are. And that's an idea, a concept that, just pause for a moment and think about it. Indigenous people being considered landless. What kind of a backwards society do you have to live in? First of all, where anybody is landless, where anybody is houseless, where anybody can be considered not a citizen of anything, which is what happened to us. Because at the time that we were disenrolled, told that we weren't citizens of who had just become known as the Turtle Mountain Chippewa in North Dakota, we still weren't technically citizens of the United States either. So what they tried to do is tell, as part of their plan to remove us, they said we were Canadian Indians, which we as Métis people, and this is kind of my segue into talking about who the Métis people are, had lived on that land. Our flag flew before the Canadian flag did. So we didn't cross the border crossed us. The Métis people are a unique cultural indigenous group recognized in Canada, but not the United States. And we're the same people. So there's the Métis Nation, there's the Manitoba Métis Federation, there's all these different Métis organizations related to the people who rose out of the Red River Valley. The Red River Valley, the Red River of the North, as mentioned in my bio, is the current border of so-called Minnesota and North Dakota. And it flows north into Manitoba, Canada, and ultimately drains into Lake Winnipeg, which ultimately drains into Hudson's Bay. So all those rivers flow to the north. And the Red River Valley is that wide open space that the first interaction between European traders in that region and indigenous people began. And for trade to happen, the indigenous practice at the time, which isn't universal, but I think even here it was part of how indigenous people established trade relations, was through family. So you had to be related to people before you would trade with them. Trade at the time was recognized as mutually beneficial to both sides of the arrangement. So these traders came and they married indigenous women, they married into indigenous families in order to become a network of trade. And it wasn't like a forced thing. The first 50 years, it was assimilation, as we talk about today, but in reverse to how we understand it. These European folks were assimilating to our culture first. But why would they do that? Well, trade, of course, but also they simply couldn't survive. These guys from France and Wales and Scotland had no concept of how you live in this river country that gets so incredibly cold in the winter and so incredibly hot and humid in the summertime. They didn't know where to forage or what to forage, who to hunt and when. And it was women who largely taught them all of these things. So that relationship was mutually beneficial to both sides. And it wasn't until more and more waves of settlers came, spearheaded by missionaries, that the relationship began to fall apart, and the threads that came together to remove us from our lands began to kind of create this web of a net around us to drag us away. So that is where we come from as Métis people, generation after generation after generation of Métis people who were the first to introduce cattle in the Northern Plains in the early 1800s. We invented the first instance of wheel use by indigenous people on the Northern Plains, also in the early 1800s. That's called the Red River cart. So it's this two-wheeled cart. The wheels are about this tall. They could come off. It was made entirely of wood. We would take that out onto the plains. Why did it take until the early 1800s to have wheels on the plains? Because prior to that, we were a river and lake people. Our mode of transportation, our highways were rivers. And we had the birch bark canoe, which remains a marvel of technology because it's light and sturdy and strong and can carry a lot of weight. So it wasn't until we started moving out regularly onto the plains that we needed a wheeled conveyance. And why is that? Because we were buffalo hunters and we were the best there is at it. And that cart was a big part of our culture to make us that. We had this mixture of European technology with indigenous ingenuity, and we'd take those carts out in groups of 20 or 30 or a couple hundred or even as many as 1,000. And we would take entire towns out onto the plains and set up our little town with our carts. And then the men, these buffalo brigades, would go out and hunt buffalo. And then they would bring it back, and the women would process all that and turn it into pemmican. Do we know what pemmican is in this part of the world? Pemmican is like the original like Cliff Bar or Kind Bar. You know those things you throw in your backpack when you go out on a hike or something because you know you're going to need energy? That's what pemmican was. It was like dried buffalo meat mixed with a lot of fat to hold it together and some kind of berry. So when we talk about being the Pembina Chippewa, the word Pembina was our word for the high cranberry. It was a key ingredient in our pemmican. And wars were fought over access to Métis pemmican. Why was it so valuable? Excuse me, slobbering all over myself. No wonder there's no one in the front row. It's like the spray zone. Why was pemmican so valuable? Well, you have all these people going out on this unfamiliar land, not knowing if they're going to be able to hunt or forage. It was food that you could live on, carried a lot of calories, and that was light. So you could take a few pounds of pemmican and know you could survive for this amount of time. It's like, you know, in the Lord of the Rings when the elves give the hobbits the lefse or whatever, the bread that they can eat to survive. That's what pemmican was. It's like Tolkien ripped off the Métis to tell his story about elven bread, right? I claim a lot of stuff from Métis people. We invented car camping. Like if you look at an old photograph, you've got these Red River carts set up next to teepees. One time I had the revelation while I was doing a presentation that had like a PowerPoint thing to go with it, and I was looking at it and it arrived that we invented car camping. You know where you park in a spot and you just set your tent up like 5 feet away and you spend the night, you feel like you're in the wilderness, and you get up the next morning, you throw it back in your Subaru, and away you go. So car camping. What else did we invent? We invented this great tradition of music, fiddle music, that we took a lot of influence from French and again Welsh and Scottish people, kind of twisted it with indigenous rhythms and pushed all the furniture to the side of the house and jig danced. And there's these great illustrations from the early 1800s of these European officers, some of whom were illustrators also of this scene in this room of all these people out dancing to fiddle music and drums and guitars. But the fiddle is a signature instrument in our culture, as are the traditional grand entries. When I talk out here, I'm realizing that so many of these things I take for granted, visions and things, might be different out here. Because this part of the world's a couple hundred years behind what is still very recent for us historically. So I see powwows all the time. I see grand entries all the time. People in traditional regalia with feathers and beads and the different designs based on the dance they're going to do. We have those too. Both at the same time, just like we have two languages. You know, one day it's the fiddle contest and the waltz and the jig dancing. The next day it's a traditional grand entry with drums and singing and rattling bells and jingle dresses, and all of those things that we associate with Plains Indigenous culture. So we're a mix of all of that stuff. And I like to say that as Métis people, we're the perfect North American. And for 100 years, that's what we were. Why would I say that? Because we were able to blend all of these good elements of what you get when differing cultures come together and intermarry, and there's love and children and community. And it was like that for quite a number of generations. And that's how it could be now, if we could figure out ways to get along and focus on the ways that we get our similarities rather than our differences. We could become this same vision of what we were initially as a culture, a mix, not a melting pot, a mix, take, ignore. And it worked for us. So that's who we are as Métis people. So there's all that historical context in the book with the thread of who my family is and why my dad decided to deny his Indigenous heritage and why that is so common in people in North America who are Native and who, you know, the generation before me and before them, like my father and my grandfather and my great-grandfather, you know, why would they choose to deny who they were? And why would they pass that down to us? Because it is ubiquitous. It's not just our story, it's the story for Native people from coast to coast. The reason for that, you know, you look at like my father and my grandfather, you know, those are the first generations coming out of boarding schools. Boarding schools were a brutal and very effective effort consciously made by the United States government in cahoots with mostly Catholic, but plenty of Protestant churches as well, to destroy our culture, to take our language. And it goes on today too. I made a comment, you know, a few events ago based on a question somebody asked. Well, why is that? We are powerful when we are culturally together. We are powerful when we are practicing our ceremonies. We weren't allowed to practice our ceremonies until 1978. You know, I was already a young adult, sort of, in 1978. I had my own collection of records, mostly Kiss records, in 1978. So it's recent. Many of these things that feel like ancient history, when we talk about them in school, if we talk about them in school, are very recent. It's like my great-great-grandparents were part of a group of 20 Métis families who came out of the Red River Valley and were living on the Milk River, which is to the north. And like so much of our territory, spans both sides of the Medicine Line, which is what we call the Canadian border. And they were burned out of the Milk River twice by the U.S. Army. This is post Battle of Little Bighorn, which, as we know, that's where Custer Gobble was coming to him. And the whole region was in an uproar. And they said, you guys either need to move or be killed. We chose to move. And we ended up in a place that is now Lewistown, Montana. It's the very literal center spot of the state of Montana. Lewistown was founded in 1879 by this group of 20 families. Why did they choose Lewistown? Because in central Montana in the late 1870s, early 1880s were the last few years of the last remaining big herds of buffalo. And as buffalo hunters, that was our culture. And we went to central Montana because you could still subsistence hunt buffalo on the open plains. That is a cultural existence that I can see on my horizon. That was my great-great-grandparents, which it is not impossible to concede or to believe that I could have met them even as an infant. You know, they're not that far removed. So our culture changed drastically in a very short time. And the result of that is people living on the fringes of communities with no livelihoods, just trying to make do, and everything that comes from the interactions with the people who like to make commentary on the people who have not. So in Missoula right now, I don't know how it is around here, but where I live outside of Missoula, we have a very terrible houseless crisis, as so many cities in the West do. And if you look at the newspaper articles about camps that they want to build or shelters that they want to build, and the horrible things that people say about our relatives who often through no fault of their own or no choice of their own are living on the fringes. Many of whom have jobs, but they can't afford to live in these places that have become so gentrified. If you look at those comments today and you go back to newspapers 100, 150 years ago, it's the same. It's like the same people saying the same things about, at the time, who we were. People who had lost our homes, had been taken by the government, who'd lost our livelihoods, who'd lost our food source because it was taken. They couldn't beat us on the battlefield, so they took out our relative, the buffalo. And it is recent to us. And at the time that my father was growing up in central Montana in the 50s, there were still signs in stores that said no breeds allowed, or no half-breeds allowed, no Indians allowed. That is a kind of in-your-face racism that not that many of us have to deal with. Some of us do still, absolutely. But it was ubiquitous and steady in Montana at that time. And he had to grow up in that environment. And all of the horrible things being said about who his relatives were, who his family was, made him not want to be any part of that family because he didn't want to be associated with it. And that story for him is the story of so many people. And I am in a position where I have never had anybody say anything like that to me. Number one, because of my white mother, I pass as white much better than my father did. But even now, when I am very much I walk through the door telling people, hey, Indian here. Yeah, I'm an Indian, in a way that he never would. And I think that's necessary. I think it's necessary for my generation to do that. Because our parents and grandparents suffered mightily so that we could be here at all. And they didn't set aside our culture and not pass it along, or not pass along our language, not because they didn't think it was valuable, it's because they wanted to protect us from the type of violence that we could face if we chose to speak our language, if we chose to practice our ceremonies. So the sacrifice they made just to preserve our existence for this time we live in now, which is probably better than it has been for 500 years to be an indigenous person, that we are finally gaining visibility in the public consciousness in a way that we have never had. Just the other day at the Emmys, depending on who you pay attention to, there were so many Indians there because of Reservation Dogs and the national success of that. Lily Gladstone and getting the Oscar nomination, and she should have won it, and the work she's doing and the visibility that she has for young Native kids to look and see themselves represented in places that we've not been allowed to be represented in before. Used to be Hollywood would get white dudes to play Indians, and it's not like that anymore. And there are plenty of other examples, other indigenous writers. There's tables of them out here. And what a time. And what an opportunity for us to reclaim what was taken from us. And I like to think that my book, besides being a story of another tribe in the historical ways that we had everything taken from us, but also just, I'm proud. And I hope that my pride comes through in the prose of that book. Because I am very proud to be who I am and where I come from. And I wish my father would have had an opportunity to feel that pride as well. And I'll never know, at least not in this world. So that's the story of the book. And I would love to answer any questions or take any comments that any of you may have based on what I've just said. Yes?
So what do you think of missionaries and how detrimental was their work to your people?
It was genocidal.
Yeah.
And it was calculated genocide, and we see it happening around the world. Right. It's just part of the missionary process. I struggle with that. I don't generally have a problem with people who find Christianity to be a means to feel at peace with the world, but the institutions I am opposed to. Like a couple years ago, the Pope came to Canada and did kind of this dog and pony show. There was like a apology tour. Not even sure what it was, but nothing happened. No changes have been made. And there's a Métis artist named Christy Belcourt, whose work is just like, I saw one of her paintings for real at the Minnesota Art Institute or whatever it's called, or Minneapolis Institute of Art a couple of years ago. And I walked in and I just burst into tears. It is so beautiful. And she said in the aftermath of that, that if the Catholic Church was really serious about apologies, reparations, whatever you want to call it, to Indigenous people, they would fund Indigenous immersive language schools all across North America for the next 100 years. And what a solution that they could afford, and what a change it would make for us. Because the restoration of our language is the most important part of what we're going to do in the next 100 years to return and just continue to rise as who we've been traditionally. Which speaks to these postcards and stuff I have on the signing table. My friend Anna is kind of minding me on this trip also, but we work together on a lot of Indigenous education programs, and language is a big part of it. So if you have any interest in that, we can talk about that later too. But thank you for that question.
So I'm sorry.
Go right ahead.
No, go ahead.
I just wanted to follow up. Where are your advocates, or are there any in the government? Who do you go to?
Well, it depends on what we want, you know.
Yeah.
So like Senator John Tester, who is in one of the most hard-fought races, the Republicans won his seat. He was elected in 2006, and the very first bill he introduced was the Little Shell Restoration Act. And he introduced that bill every session until it happened in 2019. So he's an advocate. And even our Republican representatives tend to be advocates for who we are. Though the guy running against Tester just got busted on a hot mic making drunk Indian jokes like 2 weeks ago. So yeah, I mean, we have our, because in Montana, our Native American caucus and our Indian population, we show up for elections, which is why they work so hard to make it difficult for us to vote. And like the Blackfeet Reservation is the bluest per capita community in the entire state. And so, yeah, they can't ignore us because we have voting power. But, you know, like, in fact, my watch is buzzing because I'm getting texts from our DC lawyer for the Little Shell. What time are you going to be in DC? Because I'm in DC in 2 days from now. So I'll have to respond to that when we're done here. So we do have advocates. And it's a national thing. You know, Indian people tend to be lumped together like we're some kind of monolith, which we're not. One of my favorite jokes, I mean, Anna could tell it because she's heard me say it so many times, is that if you ask 10 Indians a question, you're going to get 8 different answers, and the other 2 are going to argue why the other 9 aren't even Indians. So we don't agree on anything, and so it's hard for us. But there are groups that advocate for us as a group. Yes, Dave.
I first came to know you with your one-sentence journal, and then you followed up with that with your Haiku and Haiku collection. And how did those first books kind of lead to this book and help you on your journey to this book?
I don't know that they did, other than that they made people know who I was in the writing community. So One Sentence Journal came out on August 14th, 2018. And it was August 14th, 2023 that the governor of Montana called me and said, I'm appointing you Montana State Poet Laureate. So, and the fact that I'm Poet Laureate gives me visibility for this book that certainly works well together. But, you know, most of that writing, I was already working on this.
Okay.
So it's not like there's a linear progression. Exactly. No, this was like the life's work. And I still have presumably a fair amount of life left. So you know, this is going to be part of whatever the next one is. Because I could have rewritten this every 6 months. Because when I'd go back to edit things, you know, my perspective on things would change, and I had to kind of build fences around moments because I didn't want to rewrite this moment because that's not who I was in that moment. So that was one of the challenges too.
And how long have you been working on this?
Well, kind of the first time that I actually voiced aloud that I was thinking about writing a book about it was in 2013. and there were fits and stops. And I signed the contract for it in 2019.
Ah.
So it was 2019 that I really said, okay, well, these guys gave me some money. Now I'm actually going to have to write this book. It wasn't a lot of money. Wasn't so much that multiple times I thought, I'm just going to give the advance back and go work at Wendy's for $18 an hour. But yeah, it's been at least 10 years. Yes.
There's a famous story about Abraham Lincoln's mother. She died of something called milk sickness,
Mm-hmm.
maybe in 1818 or something like that. And what milk sickness was you drank the milk of a deer or a doe or a cow or whatever that had eaten this white snake root plant.
Mm-hmm.
And white settlers couldn't figure out what was going on.
Yeah.
Well, 50 years later, a woman, ethnobotanist, came through and asked a Native American woman about milk. She said, "Oh yeah, you get that if you drink the milk from a cow that's eating the white snake."
Right.
And I'm just wondering, it seems like there's a Harvard ethnobotanist who says that everywhere the missionaries went in South America, all this medical knowledge was lost. All the knowledge of how to live in these places. And I assume the same kind of thing is on there. Is that
It is accurate, but I also think that that's one of the changes that we're seeing now, because you have people like Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote the book Braiding Sweetgrass. She's a PhD botanist or something that does to do with plants. I'm not a college guy, so I don't really know what people have, but she talks about, when she was first going to school and what she wanted to study, these white dude professors were like saying, well, that's not science,
Right.
but it's knowledge. And she blends these two, and it even has not an acronym, initialism. It's like acronyms actually have to be words that you combine, and initialisms aren't. And so it's a constant ongoing education process for me too. So acronym has to spell out a word.
Yeah.
Right.
And TEK isn't really a word, so it's traditional ecological knowledge is a thing in science now where they're blending this. There's this great story like that I read in the Bitterroot Valley. The Bitterroot Valley is where the Salish people, due to the Hellgate Treaty of 1855, were removed and moved to their reservation out to the north. But back when settlers were first coming, there was this region where the Salish would not live. And they told the settlers, you can't live there. But they said, oh, what do you savages know? We're going to live there. It's beautiful. Well, people started getting sick and dying. And it wasn't until decades later that scientists went out there and discovered that the ticks in that region carried Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And they built this science research center there that also did a bunch of work on COVID vaccines and stuff, all because nobody believed the Salish people who said, yeah, there's sickness there. And it was legit. And it was, have you ever heard that story?
I forgot it, but now that you're saying it, it's coming back.
Yeah. It's a perfect example of what you're talking about. Native knowledge about a place and how to live in a region that went ignored by people who thought they knew better. And that's part of why people are starting to pay attention now to how we did things like fires in the West, how we used fire to prevent big fires. It's like, well, who is going to know better how to live on a certain part of land than the people who've lived there for 15,000 years? That's a great question. Anything? Yes.
So obviously we can't, unfortunately, go back to the time where this land was undeveloped, but you and I hope many others are breaking these generational curses. So how do you see the future unfolding in kind of America, and with the intertwining of this, remembering and returning back to our roots, but also having to move into the future?
Yeah, even the word undeveloped is problematic because we modify the land. Like sweetgrass grows better under human cultivation. Robin writes about that in Braiding Sweetgrass because of the centuries-old relationship we have with it. Just like the three sisters grow better when they're grown together. we have always, modified the land in a reciprocal way to benefit the land and us. Well, why is that? Because we are the land, and the land is us. We are in nature right now, every bit as much as if we were in a teepee. Everything in this room is comprised, it came from the land. Now, as people, we've gotten pretty clever at reconstituting things and taking these things to make something else, like this lectern or this microphone or these chairs, but still everything came from the land. All of the materials to go into this stuff was here when folks were raising the three sisters on farms in this region as well, 500 years ago. So we have to recognize our relationship remains tied to the land, because it always has been. And at some point, we lost the humility to recognize that. We thought we were so much better, and that, well, like the t-shirts we see where I live, log this planet first, we'll log the next one later, or something stupid stuff like that. But that is part of it. It's just that recognition of our integral relationship, and our survival depends on our ability to take care of the place that we live on. And we see those things, like there are conservation groups, which we could have a whole discussion about conservation groups, but people making efforts in broad swaths of central Montana again, which is one of the last great prairie landscapes on the entire planet. The only bigger one is in Mongolia. And there's groups working to restore that landscape, bring buffalo back to it, bring pronghorn back to it, all of these other non-human relatives who are also integral, just like we are. So it's just letting that stuff unfold. And that is what is so important about elections like this one, is the people that we choose to make the decisions that affect all of us, not just one small part of a relationship that just wants to fight with each other all the time. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, that was beautiful.
Thank you. Yes.
What's the largest need of your tribe?
Largest what?
Need. What do you need? Do you need anything from the federal government or the state government to help in any way?
We don't really want anything from anybody other than the space to do what we know how to do already, right? I mean, that sounds kind of flippant, but if we're left, if we don't have barriers, and in Indian country we have a lot of barriers. If a lot of those barriers could be removed and allow us to flourish the way we used to flourish, then we're in good shape. Now, of course, I'm all for, overthrowing capitalism, but, that doesn't happen overnight. We need it. That's part of the reciprocal relationship we're talking about. So as long as there's money in the game, then yeah, there's needs to be made ways as we move to a better way to live together. Capitalism is not a divine requirement. We lived with a different kind of commerce for thousands of years, and these ideas of how we handle land ownership and things like that create barriers to keep all of that wealth and power in the hands of a few. And those are the kinds of things that need to change, not just for my people, but for all of us. So those are all tied together. We're doing pretty well as the little shell, considering that 5 years ago, we had nothing. And now, we have this beautiful health facility we built. And, a lot of it is the result of money we got because of COVID, which is kind of a bitter pill, because COVID was terrible in Indian country. It was everywhere, but it struck Indians particularly hard. We lost our last first language Ojibwe speaker in Montana to COVID, and we don't have any more. So things like that. But yeah, it's name any social issue of marginalized people in the United States, and we could use more of that. Does that answer your question? I mean, it's a tough one, but yes.
I was just going to add that this is the person that was recognized by his tribe just a few weeks ago as the voice of his nation. So you heard it from the source.
I got a pretty sweet blanket too. That's how we honor people. We give you a blanket. You had a question?
Yes, so kind of a statement and a question, but as an enrolled citizen of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, here in North Carolina, I just really wanted to say first, I appreciate your reference to unity and collaboration, because obviously that's not always even welcomed in native country, right, among different tribes.
You're right.
But I was curious, do you know about the history of our tribe here in North Carolina?
Only a little bit. I actually just started listening to a book written by a Lummi woman.
Is it Melinda?
It's about blood quantum. What's her name?
Melinda Maynard in Latin?
No,
Maybe. I hardly remember my own name half the time, or the title of my own book. So.
But could I get just a really brief, just to give you?
Yeah, because you guys were.
So we were recognized by the state of North Carolina in 1885.
Yeah.
So 14 years after treaties were
Right.
resolved. But what was interesting, 2 years later, in 1887, my great-great-great-great-grandfather and 4 other Lumbee men went to the North Carolina General Assembly asking for money to create an Indian school, because at that time natives had no school. The General Assembly gave them $2,500 in 1887. They created the Indian Normal School, which is now UNC Pembroke. I think you know that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like changed names over the years and now is an official university. In 1956, the U.S. government, meaning Congress, passed a bill called the Lumbee Bill, which basically declared us Native Americans. They recognized us as Native Americans, just like any other tribe in the United States. But because it was the time of termination, meaning they did not want to give out benefits and services to tribes, and they were eliminating them from ones already federally recognized, our last sentence says, and all of this is entitled to you except the denial of the benefits and services offered to other federally recognized tribes.
Mm-hmm.
So for almost 70 years, our tribe, and we are all 3 Lumbee, and our friends and cousins, has been fighting the U.S. government to kind of amend that bill. Like everything is correct except the last sentence, and to give us the benefits and services. Because if you live here, you know we're one, if not the poorest county in the state, socially, economically, education-wise,
Which is typical for reservations everywhere.
Healthcare.
Yeah.
And one of my really good friends works for Tester, so I support, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
John Tester, and heard the horrible statement by the opposing person last week.
Did she?
But how, I guess, hearing you speak, obviously, we have lobbyists, we have a chairman, but it's just constantly trying to make connections with other tribes, which is what you said. I think that's like the most beneficial thing. Going to like the Native American Philanthropy Conference, going to the National Congress of American Indians, getting them to understand our story. Because here in this state, people say, you're not Native, you're not Indian, no one ever said you're Indian. And then we give the story, 1887, the state recognizes, Congress recognizes in 1956. And it's just a constant battle that we're fighting. And I hope I wasn't too long, but.
No, those are details I didn't know. I knew it had something to do with termination, but I didn't know specifically what that is. Like we were recognized by the state of Montana in 2006. So we were state recognized for more than 10 years before we were federally recognized.
And we've been state recognized for 107 years.
Right. Yeah, that's a perfect example of the types of things that tribes face. Termination was just one of various efforts made by the federal government to eliminate tribes altogether. And that book, Blood Quantum, written by one of your relatives, talks about. I've got it on my phone. I can tell you what it is.
Yeah.
Blood quantum is long game termination, because the idea being that if you don't meet a certain blood requirement, then you can't enroll. And over time, you don't have enough people who meet that requirement, and there's no one left to enroll, and tribes just go away. So it's long game genocide, and it's one of the biggest issues in tribal communities today, because it's not a real thing. And I'm so tired. I'm reaching this point lately of just constantly talking about blood I'm this much blood, I'm that much blood. It's all the same. Because if it was different, I could like go and get a blood transfusion and say, you know what, I want to be Blackfeet. Pump me full of Blackfeet. And I'm going to go ride my horse backwards. That's a Blackfeet joke. You guys don't get it. I make fun of the Blackfeet all the time because they make fun of me, my Blackfeet friends. It's our love language. And I tell people that if it wasn't for the Plains Chippewa, the Blackfeet still wouldn't know which end of the horse faces forward. So yes, But those are great points. I mean, and there's stories all over the country similar to that of tribes that either were terminated and then had to fight to be reinstated. Just the kind of backdoor arrangements that the federal government made in an effort to kind of bait and switch people into agreement. Most of our treaties were that. They didn't. I mean, you're talking about translation between people who didn't speak the language and people who were functionally illiterate in many cases, the Indian agents and stuff. So they would tell a tribal representative, this is what this says, and then they sign and it says something 180 degrees different. Or they would, like in our case, the feds said, well, the real leadership won't play with us, but you guys over here will. So we're going to say you're the chiefs. We're going to get you to sign the things we need signed, and the people who really have say or know what's going on are left out of the conversation entirely. So, I mean, it happens all over.
Well, even if you did it correctly, right, the Cherokee of Western North Carolina won a case in the Supreme Court, and Andrew Jackson said, what are you going to do?
What are you going to do?
I'm going to do this anyway.
Exactly. Yep, exactly. Yes?
Yeah, so were there times doing this research or just personally when you come across something somebody's written or a conversation and you just go, oh my God, I have never thought about that just that way, or it really is helping me decide who I am in a new way?
Yes.
I mean, you must have had 1,000 of those.
Yeah, in both directions.
Yeah.
Sometimes people say stuff that is just so stupid. I can't believe people are still, like the Sheehy comment. And then listening to all of his buddies laughing around him, But some of them, like when it comes to the Métis people, most of the scholarship is in Canada. And, just recently, I talked about at the end of reading the introduction, there's a line in there that isn't in the introduction because I discovered it after the book was already in production. And this Canadian scholar is talking about these Métis buffalo brigades that were organized just like our kinship networks. And that the group of 20 families, for lack of better words, were like royalty in this arrangement of these buffalo brigades. And this Canadian scholar talked about how for several decades, Métis buffalo brigades didn't lose a single conflict with Canadians, Americans, or other native tribes because we were so organized and so formidable out on the plains with our carts and our rifles and the way we arrange things. And while I don't like to celebrate, like military things, it made me happy to know this is where we come from. We were a proud and accomplished and mighty people, which is 180 degrees from the narrative that my dad grew up hearing. They were just drunks and losers and stupid, and our heads based on the shape of our skulls. We couldn't be smart. That was what science thought, and that is what generations of people were forced to believe, and I love the things that I've been able to learn to push back against that. Any other comments or questions?
Have you thought about doing an audiobook?
I have. I sold the rights to it, and I sent in my audition, and I'm pretty sure I'm the one who's going to do it.
I was going to say, because, not every good writer can read well and project well and speak well, and, you do a great job. So.
Thank you. I've done it a little bit.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? How are we doing on time? Yes.
What was your origin as a writer? So have you been a writer since you were young?
Pretty much.
Okay.
My goal, in the 70s when I bought my first Kiss album was I was going to be a rock star. And then a couple of years later, I decided I was going to write books on the side. And that's kind of flip-flop because I still play in a rock band, but writing is or writing adjacent things as much as anything is how I make my living. And, it was in 8th grade that when I graduated 8th grade, I won the reading award. And my teacher gave me a empty notebook, a journal, which, now you can buy them everywhere. But back then it was a novelty. Why would anybody want an empty book to write in, And in it, she inscribed, this is to help you on your way to writing your first fantasy novel. Because I thought I was going to be a fantasy writer. And there's a couple desk drawer novels in my past. And one of the great things is that, you know, I graduated high school in 1985 and I hadn't seen her since. And when we celebrated the release of my book on August 22nd, I guess it was, she was there and came, and we had a hug it out moment, and there were tears and all of that, and it was great. She'd forgotten, of course, that she'd given me that, but I talk about it all the time. You know, I get asked to talk to students, and I spend a lot of time talking to education conferences and things like that. And I always reference there's a couple teachers who, you know, I'm here because of the support I got from them, and because I had teachers along the way who treated me like a friend. You know, there were people I could be, an adult that I could be friends with who was not my own family. And while, you know, there was still a teacher-student, they were also mentors of a kind, or supporters of a kind. And what a difference they've made to my life. 40 years later, 50 years later. Well, I'm not quite that old, but close. So yeah, it's a big deal. And I celebrate those people any chance I get. As for, you know, One Sentence Journal was my first book, and at the time, before it came out, I'd published a few short stories, like in anthologies and things, like crime and noir fiction. That was kind of, you know, I didn't want to write these big fantasy novels because there's so many of them, and I didn't feel like I could do justice better than other people were. And I was kind of feeling the same way about like crime and noir fiction too. And I'd had this practice of just writing a sentence every day. And, you know, long story short, I turned a bunch of those into poems, and they came out in this book. And then people started calling me a poet. And I was like, all right, I'll be a poet. And that door just opened opportunities that, as I often talk about, I don't feel I necessarily chose. I feel like, much like Anna pointed out with my tribe recognizing me as the, whatever it was, the voice of a nation or something like that, I think my ancestors chose me. Because I have felt them every step of the way. And I have had opportunities open for me that are not my own doing, because there's no reason I should have even had the opportunity to see those doors, let alone walk through them. Because I have not followed any of the paths that you're supposed to be a poet laureate or to be a published writer. Like, list all the rules. I've followed none of them. Yet, you know, here I am, 3,000 miles from home, talking to people who never would have heard our story otherwise, probably. And I feel there is some ancestral influence going on. Anything else? You started a... You sure? I do that with like kids.
I have lots of questions.
You have what?
I have a lot of questions.
Keep them coming. You're asking great ones. Are we still good?
Oh,
Yeah, you've got another question.
One more question?
Yeah.
Okay, pick your best one.
me?
Yeah.
Oh, tell us something that you wish you had not done in your work so far. Something that you really learned.
That's a great question. Something I wish I had not done.
You don't have to tell us her name.
Well, it's two things here, and one was just like not even a week ago. I got invited out to. So let me back up a little bit, and first, like we're talking about Senator Tester, and you know there are a lot of people who have strong feelings about the position he's taken, as the position the United States has taken in relationship to what is happening in Gaza, and I am in solidarity with the people, the Palestinian people, and I don't care who you think is right and wrong in this conflict. The fact that one side can genocide another side and the world stands by and lets it happen, regardless of who's wrong, it needs to stop. Because innocent people always pay the price for what the people who tend to benefit from things, and it just has to stop. And Tester, to a certain part of our community, represents the United States, and they're all against him because of that one thing. And I can respect that, but at the same time, I get invited to do things with Senator Tester on a couple of occasions. And this one particular occasion, you know, a person said, yeah, I saw you doing that thing with Tester and I figured you were a sellout. And they come to one of my events and they say, oh, it's nice to see you're not. And my feeling is like, am I better off sitting at my desk on Instagram complaining about things to a very select pool of people who are going to agree with me anyway? Or am I better off walking out in front of a room full of all these people and saying what I have to say about it? And I feel like I can make my point much better in that, even if it's to fewer people, than if I just sit at home and I'm a keyboard warrior like so many other folks. So fast forward to 2 things. I had to do a thing with Tester again that I was invited to. It was a big fundraiser in Missoula, and Jeff Ament from Pearl Jam, that Pearl Jam played in Missoula. It was like Pearl Jam week, and they did this thing where there were nonprofits set up, and I was the MC, and then there was like a fundraiser at the theater, and they wanted me to come, and I got there and I realized they didn't want me to talk, they just wanted me to be there. And I felt tokenized. So I'm sitting there thinking, I'm nobody's freaking token. How can I turn this around? So I asked the organizer, who's doing the land acknowledgement? Do we know what the land acknowledgements are here?
Yeah.
And she just went white.
Right.
She's like, oh my God, I bet they forgot about that. So she starts running around to get the person to decide, well, we could get Latre to do the land acknowledgement. I'm on record for saying that I think land acknowledgements are like progressive liberals' versions of thoughts and prayers. They're kind of useless. So here I am about to do one. And I did it, and I did it in a different way than people typically do. And I don't need to go into that because it's very tied to that particular landscape and that particular community. And then last weekend, I got asked to do a poet laureate thing. They wanted me to come read poetry at this place called Tippet Rise, which is like an art installation in kind of central Montana. And it's for rich people. And I just felt, again, kind of tokenized, and I was really uncomfortable with it. Because it's like 13,000 acres. And so many of these folks are clapping themselves on the back about, oh, we have this land and it's preserved. And I'm like, that's more than 25% of the land that we were left to live on in 1892, And when the Turtle Mountain Reservation, when we were disenrolled from it. And I'm not describing this very well. I wish I'd done a better job of paying attention to what it was I was agreeing to do. And I think I turned that around and was able to say things that were meaningful to the people who were there. But I regret when I say, I feel I need to say yes whenever I'm asked to represent my people, because my mentor, who always said yes, died 6 months before we got our federal restoration. And someone had to pick up that torch, and it's me. So I say yes whenever I can, even being out here on the East Coast. My publisher isn't paying for any of this. Someone in Virginia said, we want you to come out and tell your story. And I said, I'm going to be there, and I'm going to do some other things around it, and somehow I will be provided in the future to pay for the freaking thing. And that's happening. But yeah, this is a long way to say I need to pay better attention to what I'm saying yes to, so I don't find myself painted into a corner, because it gets hard. It just gets hard sometimes. There's a lot of energy that goes out in confronting certain rooms of people, and this is not one of them. You folks are wonderful. That's hard to get back again. With that.
Great question.
What a great question, though. Thank you for that. You were here earlier, right?
Yeah, you signed.
I signed the book. Yeah, I thought I recognized. Are you Buck?
Yeah.
Okay, well, nice to meet you, Buck. Yeah. Thank you, guys. And I think most of you have already gotten books and gotten them signed. But if you want 3 or 4 more copies, I'll sign those too. Thank you so much. Miguel.